Hey there, U.S. history students. Welcome to the War in the Pacific, Part 2. Let's get learning. So, we finished off with Part 1 with the American advance against the Empire of Japan in the Pacific Theater from the Battle of Midway through the Battle of Iwo Jima. We're closing in on the island of Japan and how to actually attack the island and take it over and win the war was a matter of controversy, and there was a lot of discussion about how to actually do this. It seemed like most of the Japanese civilians, especially as we learned from the Battle of Saipan, had embraced the Bushido ethic of death before dishonor. And a lot of them had simply been brainwashed that the Americans were going to show up on the island and torture and hurt them, and that the Americans were evil. So the island of mainland Japan, we could only assume, had been equally prepared to deal with the Americans if we decided to actually land forces on the island. So one of the first things that we do in February 1945 is initiate an extensive firebombing campaign on Japan. Now, throughout late 1944, we had been engaging in strategic bombing of Japan. This means we would fly our airplanes over Japan. We'd look at industrial sites, manufacturing sites, etc., and we'd try to knock out those sites. But the strategic bombing campaign had been largely unsuccessful. We were unable to stop the industrial manufacturing machines of Japan. So the United States of America decided to go for a different plan of attack, which is going to lead to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. And this is important to know in the history of your country. The architect of this strategy is General Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay openly said after the war that had the United States of America not won World War II, he would be brought forth before a war crimes tribunal for crimes against humanity for what he did in the firebombing of Japan. The firebombing of Japan, similar to what you learned before with the firebombing of Dresden, involved incendiary bombs. These bombs that would explode and spread fire, catching whole towns on fire. And since most Japanese homes were made out of wood, you can imagine that these fires are going to spread rather quickly, and they're going to consume a lot of human beings. It's important to know that we upgraded our bombers during the campaign in the Pacific from the B-17 Flying Fortress, which we had at the beginning of World War II, which has a 2,000-mile range, to the B-29 Super Fortress. Now, if you take a look at the B-29, it's got pressurized cabins, it's sealed tight, so it can fly higher, and it's got a 5,000-mile range. Take a moment to think about what it must have been like to be one of the pilots or bombardiers or anybody on board a B-29. Imagine taking off from Columbus, Ohio, on a mission above Los Angeles and then flying home. That was the distance, and this was the length of time that these Americans would be in the air. So you'd go up in the air, and these are not jet planes, these are propeller planes. You're going to be in the air for 7 hours, and then bomb your target, and then fly all the way home if you're not hit. So these were very, very long missions for the men on board. The firebombing of Japan was incredibly destructive. A lot of Americans know the story of how we bombed Japan with 2 atomic bombs to end the war. What a lot of Americans do not know is that we firebombed Japan extensively for the months leading up to the dropping of the atomic bomb. And in fact, we killed far more people with the firebombing of Japan than we actually did with both of the atomic bombs. So, as you look at these, you need to understand that the significance of this in our country's history. We were so disgusted, as most civilized people were, with the attack on civilians that the Italians did when they were creating their empire, and then what the Germans did. We look at the anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. We look at the attack on civilians during the Spanish Civil War in places like Guernica. We look at the attack on civilians that the Japanese perpetrated in places like Nanking. And all of these things were absolutely disgusting and awful. What you need to know is that our country attacked civilians. Now, our country, when we attacked civilians, we did so from the air, which seems a little bit less terrible because, we're not bayoneting people in the gut and torturing them like the Japanese did in Nanking. But in dropping such incendiary bombs and then later on 2 atomic bombs, we actually kill more civilians. Although it's not as emotionally difficult to kill people from thousands of feet up in the air. But here we see the statistics. Tokyo, 100,000 dead, but there's over 1 million people that are homeless from the firebombing of Tokyo. All Japan, estimated, and we don't really know exactly how many people, but between 300 and 900,000, and those are dead, not wounded, not homeless, those are dead. Another aerial shot from the firebombing in Japan, and when I look at this image, I think, well, it looks a lot like the atomic bomb and what a city looks like Hiroshima or Nagasaki after the dropping of the atomic bomb. But these aerial photographs are nothing like the images that you see from the ground of what actually happened to people, like somebody running with a baby before a firestorm caught him, sucked him back in, and just charred him to death. When I say we firebombed Japan, I mean we firebombed all of Japan. Here are a list of every city that we bombed in Japan. And if you take a moment to pause this video and to study this particular map, you'll notice that the individuals who made this map compared the sizes of each city to an American city of a similar population. So you get a sense of how much of Japan we destroyed prior to dropping the atomic bombs. The last major battle in the Pacific was the Battle of Okinawa. Okinawa was a 2-month-long battle. It happens from April and June 1945. Remember that the war in Europe is over for the Americans and for the Europeans at this point in time. We are trying desperately to end the war in the Pacific, and Okinawa is the last campaign. Okinawa, if you look at where it's located on the map, is very close to mainland Japan. And there are native Okinawans that live there on the island. However, the native Okinawans do not consider themselves to be ethnically Japanese. And many of these Okinawans, several 100,000 of them, are going to die in this particular battle. The Battle of Okinawa ends up being the bloodiest battle in the Pacific. Over 20,000 Americans are going to die in this last major campaign. Half of the 300,000 Okinawans died. With this particular battle, the significance of it is immense for the American commanders who are planning an invasion of Japan. 20,000 Americans are going to die invading this island. What's this going to mean for the numbers of Americans who are going to die in invading mainland Japan unless we come up with a new way of invading Japan? So I'm going to pause here and I'm going to let the History Channel take over and talk about the Battle of Okinawa.
We're continually moving in closer toward Okinawa Shima. Directly overhead, squadrons of dive bombers, our dive bombers, fly toward the island of Okinawa to meet the Japs. We can see the yellow smoke of the gunfire above the battleships. We are passing transports over our starboard and over our port as we plow ahead, headed for the beach and headed for the Jap.
We debarked from our ships. We landed in Okinawa and we had no idea of what kind of resistance we will encounter. There were no Japanese, there were no natives, there's nothing. We made our way immediately to the airport that had been deserted by the Japanese, and we found a good many destroyed planes and bombs, but no resistance. By the end of the second day, we had crossed the island, and that was when our trouble began. Our progress was not by miles and not by hundreds of yards, but practically by inches, because the resistance was very strong. There's not a single one of my team who got away uninjured.
During the Battle of Okinawa, the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, died. He had been elected president in 1932 with the goal of eliminating the Great Depression and restoring the United States back to economic health. When World War II threatened the United States of America, he did something unprecedented. He ran for a third term, and in 1944, he ran for a fourth term. He was not long into his fourth term when Franklin D. Roosevelt was in Warm Springs, Georgia, which hopefully you remember Warm Springs, Georgia, the place that he went for sunshine and for swimming to help him cope with his polio. He was having his portrait painted at the time, and you see that portrait unfinished there on the right. He's posing for the portrait in the photo there on the left, and you can get a sense of how unhealthy he was at that time. He started complaining of what he called a terrific headache, and then he bowed his head and passed away. Eleanor was not with FDR at the time of his passing. However, Eleanor found out soon afterwards that another woman was, Lucy Mercer. And maybe you remember who Lucy Mercer was from our lecture on the Great Depression. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been president for so long, 12 years, that for a lot of young people in their 20s, he really was the only president that they ever really knew. And he had guided through America through so much: the Great Depression, the end of the Great Depression, World War II, and almost all of World War II. Germany surrenders in May of 1945, on May the 8th, and we are so close to winning the war in the Pacific. And Franklin D. Roosevelt never got to see the end of that war. His wife Eleanor would, and his wife Eleanor will play a significant role in the post-war world as she becomes an American ambassador to the United Nations, an organization that FDR and Winston Churchill conceived during their Atlantic Charter meeting. So who is the next president of the United States? Well, the helm is passed to the Vice President, Harry S. Truman. Harry S. Truman was originally a haberdasher from Missouri. He, check out those glasses. He had very, very poor eyesight, but as a young man, he desperately wanted to fight in World War II. So what does he do to get in as a young man, he wanted to get into World War I. He wanted to get into World War I, not World War II. And as a young man, in order to get into World War I, to join the fight, he got a copy of his eye doctor's eye chart, and he memorized the eye chart. So when given the eye exam, he passes with flying colors and joins the war. After the war, he was a haberdasher for a time, and then he joins the local Democratic Party and worked his way up to become senator from Missouri. And when World War II broke out while he was a senator, he joined a Senate subcommittee that investigated war profiteering. And he actively went after people who he felt were trying to rip off the government during wartime. And he saved the American government approximately, this is an estimate, but approximately $15 billion. That's $15 billion. And this took the notice of FDR, who was very, very grateful, and asked for him to be his running mate in 1944. So, elected vice president only in 1944, he's immediately catapulted only a few months into the administration into the presidency. Here's a very famous image of Harry S. Truman. Please notice the desk plaque that he has in the front of his desk. It says, "The buck stops here." This is Harry S. Truman's personal credo. The buck stops here. This reflects his leadership style. He is willing to make hard decisions, and he takes full responsibility for those difficult decisions. He does not deflect moral responsibility onto anybody else. He says, I will make the final decision, and I take full responsibility for it. There's nobody to blame or to point fingers at other than me. A lot of historians and others respect Harry S. Truman's leadership style. For this reason. If something bad happens, he doesn't blame anybody else. He takes responsibility for it, which is probably a good leadership quality. In particular, the American historian David McCullough wrote a very large biography on Harry S. Truman and applauds him in making very tough decisions and sticking by them and accepting full moral responsibility. And boy, does Harry S. Truman have some major decisions to make as president of the United States of America. In April 1945, we're planning an invasion of Japan. He goes to his Joint Chiefs of Staff and asks them, how many American lives is this going to cost? How much longer is this war going to go on? We got one goal in 1945, and that is to end this war. So, Army, Navy, Marines, how many men is it going to cost us? And we do not know exactly the numbers that Harry S. Truman was told, but estimates go as high as 1 million American deaths in an invasion of Japan. For Harry S. Truman, this is simply unacceptable. We're not going to expend this many American lives. But at the same time, we want Japan to surrender, and to surrender unconditionally. It is not until after the Trinity test in mid-July 1945 that Harry S. Truman receives a folder. And on this folder, it is simply written Manhattan. The Trinity test and the Manhattan Project were so top secret that not even the President of the United States of America, Harry S. Truman, knew about it. Now, Franklin D. Roosevelt knew about it, but he didn't tell his vice president about the Manhattan Project. Harry S. Truman learns about this cold when he opens the file and he reads it, and he finds out that the United States of America has successfully detonated the world's first atomic bomb, thus ushering in the nuclear era into world history, and that the United States of America has the capability of ending this war with just simply dropping these bombs. It's something he cannot resist. If the goal is to end this war as quickly as possible and to expend as few American lives as possible, for Harry S. Truman, this is a fairly easy decision. But let us take a moment to think about what this means for our country. We are going to drop an atomic bomb. The bomb is going to be dropped somewhere over Japan. Who is going to die? Civilians are going to die. And Harry S. Truman and the American people don't really know the full power of this bomb. They don't really know what it's going to do to people when it drops. They, in their imagination, it's just like, well, this bomb's going to drop, it's going to explode, and a whole bunch of people are going to die. And that's going to be it. What they don't know is the immense suffering of hundreds of thousands or more who don't die instantly with the explosion of an atomic bomb. So a lot of historians look back upon this decision that Harry S. Truman is going to make, and Harry S. Truman makes this decision fairly quickly. But we've got to be critical of this. Like, Could he have done something else? Could he have taken the bomb and exploded it on an uninhabited island and shown Japan what we have the capability of doing? Could we have done that? Could we have threatened Japan more with it instead of actually dropping it? Could we have not dropped the bomb and ended the war? Or did Harry S. Truman act in too much haste? These are excellent questions to think about. Harry S. Truman did announce that we had a very powerful bomb, and he does this at the Potsdam Conference. Now, take a look at this image. We see Harry S. Truman standing next to the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin. They met in Potsdam, and Potsdam is a suburb of Berlin, and in my personal opinion, a very nice suburb of Berlin. And they met there on July 26th, 1945. The Trinity test has already been successful. Harry S. Truman knows that we have the bomb. Does Stalin know we have a bomb? Stalin knows that we have a bomb because he's got spies in the United States of America, and he actually knows that we've got the bomb. He may have known that we had bomb before Harry S. Truman did. But at this particular conference in Berlin, in Germany, and they're in Berlin right now because they are determining the future of Germany. They're trying to figure out what to do with Germany, and what they're actually doing with it is dividing it up. There'll be East Germany and West Germany. West Germany will be a democracy. East Germany will be a communist country. And at this particular conference, Harry S. Truman threatens Japan with, quote, prompt and utter destruction. He issues this threat to Japan, hoping that Japan will just simply surrender and be done with it. But of course, they don't. So the mission falls to this man, Paul Tibbets, with his B-29 superfortress that he names after his mom, the Enola Gay. Here's the B-29. There's the bomb. Little Boy. An ironic name for a single bomb that weighs 10,000 pounds, 5 tons. This one bomb is loaded up into the Enola Gay. Not even the men on board really knew what they were doing until they were in the air, and Paul Tibbets told them, we're going to drop an atomic bomb on Japan. The target, Hiroshima. And in early August of 1945, the United States of America becomes the first, and as of right now, the only country to use an atomic bomb in war against civilians. The devastation was quick and destructive. The bomb that exploded over Hiroshima killed 120,000 people in almost a flash. But for those who were, in my opinion, not lucky enough to die instantly, they will experience incredible pain and suffering from radiation poisoning over time. Eerily, there are the famous shadows that were left behind from the explosion of the atomic bomb. Some of these shadows you can still see in Hiroshima today. Even more eerily were the shadows of human beings who were just blown into atoms. But then there were those who didn't die instantly, but the bomb still got them and wounded them, in some cases searing their clothes to their body. There were hundreds of thousands who suffered from radiation sickness and radiation poisoning. I don't have this up on a slide, but if you're interested, there's a very good and short book called Hiroshima by an American journalist named John Hersey. And this book details the suffering of the people who survived the bomb. And I read this book when I was in high school, and one of the most powerful stories in this book for me was the story of a man who got radiation sickness, and his fingernails fused in with his fingers, thus making his fingernails actually a part of his fingers, and the nerve endings from his fingers grew into his fingernails, so he could never ever cut his fingernails. And it wasn't until decades later he was able to pay for surgery that would surgically remove his fingernails from his fingers. And that little story right there gave me a powerful feeling of what one person went through. And of course, hundreds of thousands of individuals go through similar type of weird illnesses due to the fallout of the radiation. The Empire of Japan does not surrender immediately after the bombing of Hiroshima. The United States had a second bomb, which we dropped over Nagasaki with similar impact. After the dropping of the second bomb of Nagasaki, the Empire of Japan surrenders. You may wonder how the man who was in charge of the mission actually felt about killing civilians. Paul Tibbets, coincidentally, after the war was over, moved to Columbus, Ohio, specifically to Reynoldsburg. And at the end of his life, and Paul Tibbets died in 2007, at the end of his life, he was interviewed by Columbus Dispatch reporter Mike Hardin, who collected his story and asked him very blunt questions about how he felt dropping a bomb that killed 120,000 civilians instantly, people who had really nothing to do with their country's decision to attack the United States of America. Paul Tibbets' response was fairly unrepentant, but we do get a sense that he and the crew members did think of what they were doing and the humanity of what they were doing. Here's the quote from Paul Tibbets from 2005 in the Columbus Dispatch. "I knew when we got the assignment it was going to be an emotional thing. We had feelings, but we had to put them in the background. We knew this bomb, was going to kill people right and left. But my one driving interest was to do the best job I could so that we could end the killing as quickly as possible." This particular sentiment was probably shared by most Americans at the time. We were ending this war as quickly as possible, but we should not forget what we did to civilians in Japan. One last story about the atomic bomb, and one of the most bizarre and awful stories in the war in the Pacific, is the story of the USS Indianapolis. You're looking at the ship that secretly delivered the bomb to Tinian Island. It was on Tinian Island that the superfortresses like the Enola Gay took off to bomb Japan, and this is where the Enola Gay took off from. The USS Indianapolis, in carrying the bomb secretively from the United States to Tinian, had to do so very secretively. Therefore, they cut off all radio communication. They weren't allowed to talk to any other ships. Nobody was allowed to know where the Indianapolis was. To avoid getting shot by a torpedo, it would travel in a zigzag pattern, changing direction every 8 minutes, thus making it very difficult for a submarine that may spot the U.S. Indianapolis to set its sights upon it and shoot it out of the water when it's constantly changing direction. But when the USS Indianapolis delivered the bomb in the middle of July, July 25th, I believe it was, somewhere around there, of 1945, it got permission to leave Tinian, and it was headed towards Guam. It was still top secret, but it had received instructions that there were no more Japanese subs left in the Pacific. They didn't have to worry about following a zigzag pattern. It was impossible to get torpedoed out of the water. Sadly, that information was incorrect. The USS Indianapolis was shot out of the water. This happened on the 30th of July, 1945. 2 torpedoes struck the side of the Indianapolis. It went down within minutes. 300 men died on the ship. 900 men go into the water. 900 men. Very few life rafts. Most of these men are bobbing up and down in the South Pacific in life vests. When these men go into the water, they are covered with oil from the ship. Nobody knows that they're out there. They're just going to be bobbing up and down. There's no food. There's no fresh water. Most of them suffer from severe dehydration. Most of them become hysterical and start losing their minds. And then the sharks show up. The men on the USS Indianapolis who go into the water, who are bobbing up and down in life vests, going nuts simply because they don't have food or water, and nobody knows that they're out there. they suffer random shark attacks, and there was really nothing they could do about it. It was rather sad. Some men would look over at other men and they'd shake them because they think they were asleep or something, and they would turn over and the bottom half of their body had been eaten off. Whether or not a shark got you or not was a matter of sheer luck and chance. It was awful. Eventually, the United States Navy figured out that the Indianapolis was missing. The men were in the water for 4.5 days. Of the 900 men that went in, only 316 survived. It was a terrible and tragic story. Going back to the United States, being victorious in the war in the Pacific, General MacArthur had ambassadors from the Empire of Japan board the USS Missouri. MacArthur did this because MacArthur was from the state of Missouri, as was the president at the time, Harry Truman. So this was something symbolic for them that the Japanese ambassadors would get aboard the USS Missouri. And they would formally surrender, and they would surrender unconditionally. So Douglas MacArthur goes to Japan to begin the process of having the Americans rule over Japan. Now, Douglas MacArthur and the United States military and our government, we have to decide, well, what are we going to do with Japan? And what about Hirohito? Most of the major commanders in the Japanese military had committed suicide out of shame and humiliation of having lost the war, but not Hirohito. So what do we do with Hirohito? You know, we never caught Hitler in Germany, but we got the leader, the emperor of Japan. What do we do with him? Do we kill him? But Hirohito had been so complacent at the beginning of the war. He could have stopped the war from happening, but he didn't. He just did nothing. So the United States of America decides we can do something more with Hirohito. We can use him for our own propaganda campaign. Take a look at this photo. This is a photo of the Emperor Hirohito standing next to Douglas MacArthur. A photograph was taken. Of course, you're looking at this photograph, and this photograph was spread all across Japan on newspapers. Here is the Emperor of Japan, the descendant of the sun god, and he is smaller than the American general Douglas MacArthur. This picture was so stunning and shocking to the people of Japan that they could barely look at it. So conditioned were they to look up to and revere Emperor Hirohito, they simply couldn't stand seeing him standing next to an American who they'd been taught was an awful, despicable, the Americans were so awful and so despicable. This was just simply a very difficult photograph to look at. And then the Americans had the emperor get on the radio and announced that the Americans are to be embraced as friends. So here comes the American military to occupy Japan, and because the Emperor Hirohito, whom we kept alive, gave this radio address telling the Japanese people to invite the Americans onto the island and that we were honored guests, the Japanese people did not put up any resistance. So this was a very wise move by our government. Also, for what it's worth, the Japanese people, not only had they not seen an image of Hirohito like this before, but they'd also never heard his voice. And so hearing that radio broadcast was a very powerful thing for them. And it's all over. Early September 1945, VJ Day, Victory in Japan Day. This war is finally over. The United States of America is victorious. But what we do after the war is very important. Let's remember the lesson of World War I. What happened to Germany at the end of World War I? Well, there was the Treaty of Versailles. What did the Treaty of Versailles do to Germany? It humiliated Germany, and it economically destroyed Germany. So what the United States of America is going to do at the end of World War II is learn the lesson of the end of World War I. Are we going to humiliate our enemies? No. We're going to do something very different. Meet General George Marshall. He was our U.S. Army Chief of Staff during World War II, What this meant was he was the high-ranking American general who was in Washington, D.C. with President Roosevelt and then later President Truman, and he was the one who was communicating between the government and our generals like Eisenhower and MacArthur. General George Marshall comes up with a peace plan for what to do with Germany and with Japan. Most famously, he initiates the European Recovery Act. This is simply remembered as the Marshall Plan. What are we going to do with Germany? Check this out. We're going to give the people in Europe who had been controlled by the Nazi Empire $12 billion to help them recover their country. $12 billion of American taxpayer money is now going to go to Europe to help rebuild Europe. $2.4 billion, and I need to say the $2.4 billion here is not part of the technical Marshall Plan, but this was funding that was going to go to Japan and in a similar way that the $12 billion went to Europe. $2.4 billion goes to Japan to rebuild Japan. Look at what the United States of America is doing. It's taking this massive taxation that it began collecting during the New Deal plans of Franklin Roosevelt, and now our economy is so strong. Half of the world's industrial production is coming out of the United States of America in 1945. Our economy is so strong, we're going to take billions of dollars to help rebuild the world. So you can joke that what the United States of America did is completely bomb Germany, completely bomb Japan, and then we rebuild it. What an incredible thing. We bomb a country to dust, and then we use our own money to rebuild the country. In total, the United States of America provides a grand total of $44.3 billion to countries across the world to rebuild their country between the years of 1945 and 1953. Did this work? You betcha it worked. Japan and Germany are now our close friends. They are allies. They are trading partners. We are on very good terms with both Japan and Germany. And to symbolize that, I have got examples of cars. Honda is built here in Marysville, Ohio, but it's a Japanese company. Volkswagen, BMW, Audi, Porsche, all these German cars. I mean, we drive them here. And if you go to Japan or Germany, you'll see American cars being driven over there as well. For all this, George Marshall, congratulations. You won the Nobel Peace Prize. And the end of it is that our country is a world superpower. Who won World War II? We won World War II. And we are helping to reconstruct the world financially. Our armies are all over the world. Even still today, there are American Army bases located in Japan, also in Okinawa and also in Iwo Jima. And we've also got military bases in Germany. Specifically, the city I can think of is the city of Bamberg in Germany. There you'll see a lot of American soldiers walking around Bamberg, Germany. United States of America is a superpower. But let us not forget, we are not the only superpower. Compare the United States deaths during World War II, 420,000, to the loss of life experienced in the Soviet Union, 24 million Soviets. And if we're honest with ourselves, the United States of America might not have been able to pull off a successful D-Day invasion in 1944 had it not been for the prolonged fighting between the Nazis and the Soviets, in which the Soviets won between 1941 and 1944. The Soviets are the ones who got to Berlin first in 1945. The Soviets won the war on the Eastern Front, and arguably, had it not been for the Soviet Union, the United States of America would not have emerged victorious in World War II. So, the Soviet Union, a communist country that does not like the capitalist USA, and the capitalist and democratic USA does not like the communist dictatorship of the Soviet Union. Here are the two world's powers. They are both spreading their money and their influence all over the world, and thus initiates our next unit, the Cold War, in which the United States of America and the Soviet Union compete for the influence of world domination. All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for paying attention. Hope you learned something. See you in class. Bye-bye.